In early 1942, as the world was consumed by the flames of war, the United States pinned its aerial hopes on a remarkable machine, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It was unlike anything the skies had seen before. With its twin booms, central nacelle cockpit, and two turbo-supercharged Allison engines, the P-38 looked more like a futuristic experiment than a combat aircraft. Newspapers called it the fighter of tomorrow. It was fast, blindingly fast for its time, capable of crossing entire oceans when most fighters could barely make it across a country. It could climb higher than enemy planes, carry more firepower, and stay in the air far longer. On paper, it was the perfect weapon, America's answer to air superiority. But as soon as the Lightning reached the front lines, cracks began to show. In the skies over the Pacific, U.S. pilots quickly learned that numbers on a technical sheet didn't always mean victory in a dogfight. The agile Japanese A6M0 could turn inside the P-38 with ease. Every time a Lightning pilot tried to match the Zero's tight maneuvers, he found himself outflanked, outturned, and sometimes shot down before he could even fire a burst. In the European theater, things weren't much better. Over the cold skies of Germany and France, the Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s found a weakness the Lightning couldn't hide: its control system. At high speeds, the P-38's controls stiffened dramatically. Pilots called it lockup. When diving toward an enemy or trying to escape, the air pressure on the control surfaces became so great that the pilot physically couldn't move the stick. The plane would plunge faster and faster, the nose frozen downward, the controls refusing to respond. Some pilots blacked out under the immense G-forces. Others never pulled out at all. Reports poured in. Brilliant young men vanishing into the ocean, their aircraft seen diving uncontrollably before disintegrating in mid-air. The P-38 was fast, yes, but it was a beast that could turn on its own master. At Lockheed's Burbank factory, engineers pored over the data in frustration. The Lightning had been designed with precision and genius. Its twin engines gave it redundancy. If one failed, the other could bring the pilot home. Its tricycle landing gear made it stable on runways. Its armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, made it deadly accurate. So how could such a masterpiece betray its pilots in the sky? The issue lay in the very thing that made the P-38 revolutionary: speed. At over 400 miles per hour, airflow across the control surfaces created enormous pressure. The elevators, the small moving sections of the tail that controlled pitch, were being slammed down by the wind, overpowering the pilot's ability to lift them. The harder a pilot dove, the tighter the controls became, until the Lightning became a missile, a 10-ton bullet hurtling toward the ground. To the men who flew it, the P-38 was a paradox. It could outrun anything. It could outclimb anything. But when pushed to its limits, it could kill its own pilot. Even veteran aces like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, who would go on to become America's top-scoring fighter pilots, spoke of the Lightning's danger with respect and fear. Bong once said, "If you don't treat her right, she'll drop you faster than a Zero ever could." In combat, this meant the P-38 had to be flown carefully, almost cautiously. Pilots were warned not to dive too steeply or chase too hard. But in war, rules like that often meant death. The enemy didn't wait. If a Lightning held back, the Zero would strike first. Inside briefing rooms, frustration grew. The aircraft was supposed to be the pride of American engineering, yet its pilots were dying in mysterious, uncontrollable dives. Engineers called it compressibility, a problem no one fully understood at the time. At high altitudes and speeds approaching the sound barrier, shock waves formed on the wings and tail, disrupting the flow of air and robbing the controls of effectiveness. It was a new frontier of flight, one few dared to explore. Lockheed's test pilots risked their lives trying to replicate the problem. Over California's Mojave Desert, they dove from high altitude, pushing the Lightning past its limits. Many returned shaken. A few didn't return at all. The factory hung heavy with silence each time a pilot failed to pull out of a dive. Kelly Johnson, the 32-year-old chief engineer behind the P-38, refused to give up. Known for his brilliance and temper in equal measure, Johnson worked tirelessly with his small Skunk Works team, sketching ideas late into the night, searching for a fix. But nothing seemed to stop the deadly dive lock. Meanwhile, the men at war had no choice but to keep flying. They learned small tricks, starting dives from lower altitudes, easing into maneuvers instead of forcing them. Anything to keep the aircraft under control. But even then, every mission carried a whisper of fear. Pilots gave the Lightning nicknames: the Widowmaker, the Fork-tailed Devil, the fastest coffin in the sky. Yet they also admired it. It could carry them home on one engine when no other fighter could. It could fly thousands of miles across open water. It was a beautiful contradiction, a killer and a savior all in one. By the end of 1942, the message was clear. The P-38 Lightning was a marvel of design, trapped by a mystery of physics. The Army Air Force needed answers, and fast. Every day that passed, another squadron lost a pilot to the same invisible enemy, the airplane's own speed. But help was about to come from the most unexpected place, not from a general, not from a scientist, but from an ordinary civilian with an idea so simple, so strange, that it would change the Lightning's fate forever. The winter of 1943 hung heavy over California's San Fernando Valley. Inside the Lockheed plant at Burbank, frustration filled the air thicker than the smell of oil and metal. Every week, telegrams arrived from the front lines. Another pilot lost, another Lightning gone into a fatal dive. The engineers were exhausted, haunted by the same mystery. Why did the P-38 lock up when pushed to its limits? Kelly Johnson, the fiery young chief engineer, stalked the factory floor with a permanent scowl. He designed the Lightning to be a masterpiece, a symbol of American innovation. But now his creation was costing lives. "There's an answer here," he muttered one night to his assistant, slamming his fist onto a workbench. "We just haven't looked at it the right way." In the corner of the hangar worked a man who rarely spoke, a machinist named Joe Barton. He wasn't a graduate of Caltech. He wasn't a test pilot or an aerodynamicist. He was a blue-collar genius, a man who had spent 20 years shaping metal with his hands, not solving equations on paper. Barton's co-workers called him the Fixer because he had a strange way of seeing problems differently. To him, machines were alive, systems that wanted to move a certain way, if only you let them. One evening, as the engineers argued over control stiffness and airflow equations, Barton quietly stepped forward. He'd been listening for weeks. "Mr. Johnson," he said in his calm, deliberate voice, "maybe the problem isn't the controls themselves. Maybe the airplane's fighting the pilot." The room went silent. Johnson turned. "And what makes you say that, Joe?" Barton shrugged, wiping grease from his hands. "You're trying to overpower the air pressure with brute force. You're forcing the pilot to fight nature. What if—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What if you let the airplane help him instead?" The engineers stared, unimpressed. Barton wasn't one of them. He didn't have the fancy vocabulary or the degrees. But Johnson, to his credit, didn't dismiss him. The man had a reputation for insight. "All right," Johnson said. "Go on." Barton walked to a drafting table and picked up a pencil. He began sketching something small, a tiny metal plate mounted under the wings, just ahead of the ailerons. "When the Lightning dives too fast," Barton explained, "air pressure builds up under the wings. That pressure could push this plate down automatically, just a little. Enough to shift the airflow, lift the nose, and stop the dive before it gets dangerous." An engineer scoffed. "You're talking about an automatic flap? We'd never control it accurately at that speed." Barton looked up, unbothered. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to work when things go wrong." Johnson leaned in, studying the sketch. It was simple, almost too simple. No new hydraulics, no electric motors, just a pressure-sensitive flap that responded to the air itself. Nature doing the work. That night, Johnson called his top engineers into his office. "Gentlemen," he said, holding up Barton's drawing, "we're building this." They worked through the night, cutting metal, testing hinge points, calculating airflow loads. Barton stayed beside them, offering quiet suggestions. When a part jammed, he filed it down himself. When a measurement didn't fit, he adjusted it by feel. He wasn't designing by formula. He was designing by instinct. By dawn, the prototype dive recovery flap was ready. It was barely 2 feet long, but to Johnson, it looked like hope. The following week, they bolted the device onto the belly of a test P-38. The test pilot would be Tony Levier, one of the bravest flyers in the business, a man who'd already risked his life dozens of times for Lockheed. Before takeoff, Barton walked up to the plane, his hands still greasy from the shop. "You'll feel her shake when she dives," he told Levier. "But this time, she'll pull herself out." Levier gave him a half smile. "You sure about that?" Barton nodded once. "She wants to live, same as you." The engines roared to life. The twin propellers spun into a silver blur as the P-38 rolled down the runway and climbed into the clear California sky. Johnson and his team watched from the ground, shielding their eyes against the morning sun. At 30,000 feet, Levier pushed the nose down. The lightning dropped like a stone. The air screamed past the canopy. The controls stiffened, just as before. But this time, the new flap deployed automatically, catching the slipstream. The plane's nose began to rise, gently, steadily. On the radio, Levier's voice crackled with disbelief. "She's steady. She's holding!" I can pull out, smooth as silk. On the ground, cheers erupted. Johnson slammed his cap onto the table and shouted, "It works! The damn thing works!" When Levier landed, he climbed out of the cockpit, pulled off his helmet, and walked straight to Barton. "You saved my life up there," he said, shaking the machinist's hand. Barton just smiled. "Didn't save your life," he said quietly. "The airplane did. I just showed her how." Word spread quickly through the plant. The impossible problem had been solved not by a scientist, but by a machinist with grease on his hands and imagination in his heart. The engineers who once laughed now studied his design with newfound respect. For Kelly Johnson, it was a humbling moment. "Never underestimate a man who understands how things move," he said later. The simple, automatic flap would soon be tested further, refined, and installed on every production P-38. But in that single night, something changed forever inside Lockheed. They realized that genius didn't always wear a white coat. Sometimes it wore a work apron, and Joe Barton, the quiet machinist who dared to question the experts, had just given America's most dangerous fighter plane a second chance at life. The California desert stretched endlessly under the morning sun, a canvas of gold and silence. On a dusty runway at Muroc Army Airfield, what would one day become Edwards Air Force Base, a team of Lockheed engineers gathered beside a silver P-38 Lightning. This wasn't just any Lightning. It was the first to carry Joe Barton's strange little invention. Two small, curved dive recovery flaps no bigger than a man's arm, mounted under each wing. To most of the engineers, it looked ridiculous, a child's experiment bolted onto a warplane. Too simple to save a plane going 500 miles an hour, one of them muttered. "That thing will probably snap off before it even works." Kelly Johnson didn't reply. He just stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the simplest ideas are the hardest to believe. Joe Barton stood a few feet away, quiet as always. His work boots were dusty, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hands stained with grease. He wasn't part of the official test team, just the man who dreamed up the device everyone was about to bet their lives on. The pilot for the test, Tony Levier, climbed out of a jeep and strode toward the aircraft. He was one of Lockheed's best, fearless, confident, and razor-sharp in the cockpit. But even he knew what was at stake. The last time someone had tried to dive a P-38 that deep, the plane had gone down and never come back. Levier glanced at Barton and grinned. "You really think that little flap of metal can stop a 10-ton airplane from killing itself?" Barton gave a small nod. "It doesn't have to stop it. Just help it breathe," Levier chuckled. "Well, let's hope she remembers to breathe then." The engines fired up with a deep, throaty roar, two Allison V-1710s spinning in perfect harmony. Dust blew across the runway as the Silverbird began to roll. The sound grew to a thunder as the P-38 lifted gracefully into the open sky, climbing higher, smaller, until it was just a glint above the desert. The ground crew gathered around the radios. Johnson kept his headset pressed tight. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from that terrible uncertainty only engineers know. On the line between genius and disaster, there's no middle ground. At 30,000 feet, WWII leveled off, checking his instruments. The sky above him was dark blue, the air thin and biting. He took a deep breath, pushed the throttles forward, and tilted the nose down. The Lightning began its descent. At first, everything felt normal. The engines roared, the air whistled past the canopy. But within seconds, the speed indicator began to climb rapidly. 350, 400, 450 miles per hour. Then came the familiar pressure. The stick stiffened, the nose began to tuck under, and the plane trembled as if caught in an invisible fist. WWII's heart jumped. "Here we go," he muttered. "Let's see if you work, little flap." Back on the ground, Johnson's team watched the altitude needle drop faster and faster. They could hear WWII's voice crackle through the static. Controls tightening. Speed approaching critical. Altitude 22,000. There was a long pause. Then the sound of wind screaming through the radio. And then, something miraculous happened inside the cockpit. WWII felt it, a sudden smooth lift beneath the wings. The P-38's nose began to rise, gentle but sure. The violent shaking vanished. The stick came alive in his hands again. The Lightning, for the first time in its life, that was under control in a high-speed dive. WWII eased back, the G-forces pressing him into the seat as the aircraft pulled out. Leveling off at 15,000 feet. His pulse raced, but a smile broke across his face. "She's holding steady," he radioed in. "No lockup, no buffet. Barton's flap just saved her." On the ground, silence turned to cheers. Johnson slammed his cap onto the hood of a truck and shouted, "It works! It actually works!" Barton didn't shout. He just exhaled slowly, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The machine had done exactly what he believed it could. It had saved itself. WWII climbed higher and dove again, faster this time. Once more, the flaps deployed automatically, stabilizing the Lightning perfectly. It was no fluke. Barton's impossible idea had just rewritten the rules of high-speed flight. When the plane finally landed, dust billowed as the tires screeched across the runway. The propellers slowed to a stop, and the canopy popped open. WWII climbed out, helmet under his arm. Face red from the strain and but grinning wide, he walked straight up to Barton. "Joe," he said, shaking his hand. "That little piece of metal might have just saved every Lightning pilot in the world." Barton smiled modestly. "Just gave her a chance to do what she was meant to." Kelly Johnson stepped forward, eyes bright with pride. "You did more than that, Joe," he said. "You made the impossible possible." Over the following weeks, more tests followed. Steeper dives, faster speeds, heavier loads. Every time the results were the same. The P-38 that once fell apart at high velocity now danced through the sky like a trained bird. The dive recovery flaps deployed automatically, catching the air and guiding the plane back to safety. The engineers who once mocked Barton's simplicity now studied his design with awe. It wasn't just clever, it was elegant, a perfect harmony between man, machine, and nature. Lockheed filed a report to the U.S. Army Air Force. New automatic dive recovery system successful. P-38 now stable through full high-speed dive range. News spread fast. Squadrons overseas would soon receive the upgrade. For the first time in months, P-38 pilots could dive without fear. The Lightning had been tamed. That night, long after the test crew had gone home, Barton stood alone beside the now silent aircraft. The silver wings glowed under the setting sun. He reached out and touched the cool metal skin. "Good girl," he whispered. "Told them you could do it." And high above the quiet desert, a contrail faded into the evening, the mark of an impossible dream that had finally taken flight. By the summer of 1944, the war had changed. Over the blue Pacific, over the burning fields of Europe, and through the icy altitudes of the Himalayas, one aircraft was carving its legend into the sky, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It had started as a problem child, an unpredictable machine that terrified the men who flew it. But now, with Joe Barton's dive recovery flaps installed beneath its wings, the Lightning had become something else entirely. Fast, fearless, and finally free. When the new P-38s arrived at frontline bases, pilots could hardly believe the difference. Gone were the warnings that had once haunted their briefings. Never dive too steeply. Don't chase too far. Don't fight the air itself. Now, the order was simple. Fly it like it was meant to be flown. The first missions with the modified Lightnings stunned everyone. Over New Guinea, American pilots dove through enemy formations at blistering speeds, 480, 500, even 550 miles per hour, something that would have been suicide just a year earlier. When the enemy tried to follow, their wings tore or their engines quit. The P-38s, by contrast, pulled out smoothly, climbing back into the fight like silver predators. In the European theater, Luftwaffe pilots began to whisper about the new Lightning. They had seen the earlier ones, powerful but clumsy, easy to bait into deadly dives. Those days were gone. Now, when a German pilot tried to escape downward, the American fighter would follow, arrow straight, and somehow always pull out unharmed. They gave it a new nickname, der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots had their own names for it. Two-tailed dragon, white lightning. Whatever the language, the meaning was the same. Fear. For the men who flew it, the change was more than technical. It was psychological. They trusted their machine now. The Lightning no longer fought them. It fought with them. Captain Richard Bong, who would become America's top ace with 40 aerial victories, called the P-38 a dream with wings. He could dive on a zero, fire a burst from those nose-mounted guns, and climb back into the clouds before the enemy even reacted. Every maneuver was cleaner, every escape safer. The confidence this gave the pilots was electric, and it showed in the results. Across every theater, kill ratios soared. Bombers returning from deep raids had long prayed for a Lightning escort, and now they had one that could keep up with anything. In the skies over Europe, the twin-engined silhouette became the last thing many German pilots ever saw. Back home, at Lockheed's plant in Burbank, the news spread quickly. Engineers crowded around bulletin boards where combat reports were posted. Lightning claims 3 over Rabaul. P-38 sweep Berlin skies. No losses. And in the corner of the hangar, Joe Barton would simply nod, wipe his hands on a rag, and go back to work. He had no desire for medals or headlines. When a reporter once asked about his invention, he said, "It's not about credit. It's about pilots coming home." Kelly Johnson never forgot that. In meetings, he'd often tell new engineers, "Remember the machinist who saved the Lightning." Never ignore a good idea just because it doesn't come from the top. By late 1944, every new P-38 rolling off the assembly line carried Barton's dive recovery flaps as standard equipment. The Army Air Forces made it official policy. The modification was even retrofitted to older aircraft in the field, a logistical miracle that saved countless lives. The results were undeniable. The P-38 now dominated the war's longest, toughest missions. Photo reconnaissance over the Himalayas, escort duty over Berlin, strafing runs in the Philippines. Wherever it flew, it was unmatched. Pilots spoke of how smooth the new Lightning felt at high speeds, how it no longer shuddered or screamed when pushed to the edge. Some said it felt alive, as if it finally understood what they wanted it to do. And in a way, maybe it did. Barton's small metal flaps had given the airplane something close to instinct, a way to sense danger and correct itself before disaster struck. It wasn't just a fix. It was a partnership between man, machine, and air. By the time victory came in 1945, the P-38 had become a legend. It was the only American fighter used in every theater of World War II, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen Aleutians, from the jungles of the Pacific to the skies above Berlin. Historians would later call it the most versatile combat aircraft of its era. A fighter, a bomber, a reconnaissance platform, even a long-range escort that could fly where no single engine plane dared. But among the men who flew it, one memory stood above all, that feeling, during a dive, when the world blurred and the aircraft began to tremble, and then suddenly steadied itself. That was the moment they knew they'd live to fight. Another day, and every one of those moments, traced back to a machinist in Burbank, who believed that a plane could save itself if given the chance. When the war ended, Joe Barton returned quietly to civilian life. There were no medals, no ceremonies. His name never appeared in the newspapers, but the pilots knew. Letters arrived from across the world. Short, heartfelt notes from men who owed him their lives. "Your idea saved me over France. The flaps pulled me out at 25,000 feet. Barton kept them in a small wooden box on his workbench. He never showed them to anyone, but sometimes, when the shop was quiet, he'd open the box and read a few lines, smiling to himself. He hadn't changed history for fame or fortune or glory. He'd done it because he loved machines, and because he believed that sometimes, even the fiercest of them just needed a little help remembering how to fly. And so, long after the war ended and the roar of the P-38 faded from the skies, Barton's invention lived on, in every high-speed jet, every diving airframe that owed its safety to the principles he proved. The Lightning had started as a beast to be tamed. Thanks to one civilian's impossible idea, it became untouchable, a symbol of courage, creativity, and the quiet power of human ingenuity.